Morning, everyone. My name's Tim Breyer. I'm coming to you from Melbourne. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there with you, but thank you to Linda Blanchard and the other organisers of the conference for enabling me to make this intervention via a pre-recorded video. And hopefully I'll get a chance to engage with you afterwards via WhatsApp or something like that. So assuming all things are going to plan, you should have just heard from Lucio about the venom of corruption plaguing Timor politics. And with my presentation, I intend to respond to Lucio from a particular theoretical perspective with the aim of hopefully opening up some novel possibilities for thinking about and addressing corruption in Timor. Therefore, let me just briefly state up front that my own personal research interests are in undertaking an imminent critique of peace and conflict theory in order to open up the possibilities for advancing peace theory and practice. And the particular theoretical position from which I make this critique is what has recently been termed Lacan-Hegelian dialectical materialism. Or in another context, transcendental materialism. And I'm not going to go into any details on that here, but rather just to say that, in what follows, in responding to Lucio's presentation, I do so from this particular theoretical position. So to begin, the first thing I want to emphasize is that any notion of society is founded upon an act of violence that must remain hidden or occluded for the current society to maintain the appearance of naturalness or neutrality. And this is a point that's been made recently in a quite wonderful way by Alenka Zupancic and Slavoj Žižek in a joke that they both tell. And the joke goes something like this. There's a group of anthropologists and they come across a tribe deep in the jungle. And the anthropologists ask the tribe, "Are you cannibals?" And the tribe responds and says, "No, we're not cannibals. We ate the last one yesterday." So the point here is that this violent act of eating the last cannibal, which gives rise to the new society of non-cannibals, is this constitutive violent act that must remain hidden in order for the society of non-cannibals to appear neutral and consistent. Or in other words, it's this act of eating the last cannibal that creates a social antagonism that touches on the very question of the constitution of society. And by antagonism here, we do not mean a conflict between two or more groups, but rather something that pertains to the logic of reality itself, or the construction of reality itself, a reality in which these two groups come into conflict. If you like, it's the third perspective that we don't see in the conflict. And this social antagonism undermines the apparent neutral status of society. And it's also, importantly, a political and theoretical place from which to undermine the current society and from which to start again, build new political projects. Now, we could debate at length here about what an equivalent act of eating the last cannibal might be in relation to Timor society today, or more importantly, how the social antagonism manifests itself in Timor. But the point I want to emphasize here is that there is no neutral or natural way to organize society. It's not as if once Timor got independence, then Timor society naturally evolved into liberal parliamentary democracy, for example. And this is a point the philosopher Alain Badiou made in relation to the Arab Spring movements in the Middle East, that in no way does the protesting groups on the street, in no way are they demanding, or is there a natural demand for democracy within those protests? Or another way to put it is there's no objective view of society that can tell us what's going on, no perspective from which we can view and understand anything. And this ultimately means that society is both fragile and unstable, and that it can be changed. So this brings me to the second point, which is about rules. Society is governed by different layers of rules. Firstly, there's the explicit or public rules of society. For example, in Timor, we have the laws of parliamentary democracy, we have the the rules and laws around elections, more generally the rule of law, rules about which side of the road to drive on, rules around immigration, and so on. And these explicit rules, of course, support the dominant idea of society, the dominant political economy of society. And these rules also appear neutral. They appear to offer a neutral view of what's going on inside society. And so it's from this perspective of these explicit public rules that we might say that corruption simply appears as a crime. Corruption is a crime that transgresses these explicit and public rules that govern a democratic capitalist society. And one thing that I think this perspective assumes is the idea of that there is a complete or full idea of society. That there's the idea of a perfect democratic society that then gets undermined by corruption. But as we discussed earlier, there is no perfect, complete, or whole society. There's always a social antagonism within it that makes it inconsistent. And so it's in the Lacanian sense, and this comes back to the initial topic of my presentation, there's an enjoyment in seeking to regain this kind of lost wholeness of democracy. And I think this is one way that peace theory also enjoys. For example, John Burton, the peace theorist, emphasized how social structures undermine this kind of fullness of basic human needs and therefore need to be overcome in order to realize the needs of humans in a conflict. But moving on, in addition to or behind these explicit public rules, there is another set of rules that are implicit or unwritten rules. What some have called perhaps the moral law, or I think quite correctly what we can refer to as culture. The common sense rules that we all live by. And I think one way we can understand these is when we travel to another country and we experience culture shock. It's not the explicit public rules that give us the shock, because we can kind of more or less figure them out quite easily. And they're often they're often the same as what we have in our own countries. But it's these implicit, unwritten cultural rules that we're not privy to as visitors to a country, that we can't figure out what's going on. And these are an indication of, this culture shock is an indication of these unwritten cultural rules. A key point here is that even though these unwritten rules typically take the form of a transgression of the explicit public rules, they nonetheless are not in direct opposition to the public rules. Rather, they exist to protect and regulate access to the social antagonism at the heart of society, or at the heart of the public law. And it's in this way that the Slovene philosopher Slavoj Žižek has repeated on numerous occasions that it's these unwritten rules that more strongly connect and define a community than any of the explicit rules. And I think, again, understanding these unwritten rules in the sense of culture, I think makes this point quite explicit. So back to corruption, from this perspective of the unwritten rules, we can say that corruption is not simply a crime that transgresses the explicit rules of a liberal democratic society and the rule of law, but rather corruption serves as the implicit support for a liberal capitalist society. Or to put it another way, corruption is the culture of liberal democratic capitalism. And I think that's why it seems that often we might say that good people turn bad when they enter into politics. But I think the point is not that, people are corrupt and they see politics as a way of exercising their hidden corrupt desires or anything like that, but rather it's the culture of liberal parliamentary democracy that, I guess, incites corruption in those who get into that culture, who get into politics. And indeed, if we turn to Klitgaard's work that Lucio references, he showed how fighting corruption, or the idea of fighting corruption, has been used time and again as a means by which to win election campaigns and stage military coups. Certainly in Fiji, where I spent 15 or so years living and working, that was the driving force behind the 2006 military coup there. But Clickguard says even in these situations where, you know, a government comes into power through fighting corruption, they may even set up new explicit public rules and institutions to fight corruption, but nonetheless, they only end up in new forms of corruption. And so I think, again, that speaks to this idea of the culture of corruption that is not necessarily legal in the explicit public laws, but is nonetheless the implicit culture underpinning those and supporting those explicit public rules. So like Clickguard, then we have to ask ourselves what can or should be done to counter corruption. And I think it should be clear by now that simply countering corruption by reinforcing the explicit rules of liberal democratic capitalism will prove ineffective, because they just incite the culture of corruption. You know, the prohibition that they set up incites its own transgression through these unwritten laws. Rather, the challenge is to occupy the position of the social antagonism, the position of eating the last cannibal, if you like, which, as I said, is the position from which to both undermine the established order and through which to develop and assert new political projects. Another Slovene philosopher, Alenka Zupančič's brilliant new book on the figure of Antigone, which is called Let Them Rot, provides the theoretical basis, I think, for thinking through this type of politics. Further, Nazan Ustendag has applied this politics of Antigone, if you like, that Zupančič writes about to Kurdish women politicians in Turkey, whom she describes, and I think this is really important for peace and conflict studies and theory as well, she describes as monstrous figures who disregarded the rules of conduct proper to peace politics and effective regimes of reconciliation. So, for example, she tells the story of Leyla Zana, who was being sworn into parliament. The explicit rules of the parliament stated that Kurdish language and symbols are prohibited in Turkish parliament. So they were the explicit public rules, if you like. The moral rules or the unwritten rules came from her party, of which she was a member of. Now, of course, again, as a transgression, the instigation would have been there for her party to use the moment of parliament to undertake an act of protest, if you like, to transgress those rules. But her party said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to respect the parliament. We've finally got, you know, we're finally in government. We're going to respect that. And so no one is to be using this as an opportunity for protests. But Leyla ended up, just like Antigone, defying both sets of rules. She defied both the public ones and the unwritten ones of her party. And when she was sworn in, she wore a hairband in Kurdish colors and twice said her parliamentary oath in Kurdish language. So again, she didn't just transgress the explicit rules, but even the moral rules of her own party. And I think the way that this emphasized and opened up the space of the social antagonism, or the eating of the last cannibal, can be sensed from the way she concluded her oath by saying, I take this oath for the brotherhood between the Turkish people and the Kurdish people, which cut through this logic of inclusion, exclusion, and belonging and non-belonging. Alenka Zupančič also sees this kind of political act in the female protesters in Iran, who seek to occupy a position that is neither Western liberal nor the more traditional religious perspective within Iran. And I guess the critical question that we should be asking ourselves is, how can we move from these more individual acts to a collective politics of Antigone, or a collective politics which engages with the social antagonism, occupies the social antagonism? So to conclude regarding corruption in Timor, those who are most monstrous or dangerous are not those engaged in corruption, nor those who say no to corruption in order to uphold some idea of the liberal democratic society. and rule of law, but rather the ones who say no to both, the ones who dare to hold open the space for new ways of structuring Timor society. And this ultimately means restructuring enjoyment away from seeking to restore a lost sense of full peace and democracy that has been undermined by corruption, and rather restructuring it towards perhaps what Todd McGowan, the US philosopher, calls the contradictory politics of emancipation, that goes beyond the socially authorized space and takes up a position that doesn't fit within the map of the social order. So thank you. I'll leave it there. And I hope that I've triggered some thoughts, some comments, some critique, and that we can engage in a conversation later. Thank you.